Middle Class and Emergence of Indian Nationalism. Welcome learners. Emergence of Indian nationalism is the topic which is to be discussed in this module. Nationalism is an idea that nurtures the need of a certain nation with the intention of attaining and sustaining the nation's sovereignty over the motherland. Indian nationalism evolved as a notion during the Indian independence movement, which pushed for independence from British rule. In this module, we shall deal with the following topics: Indian middle class and growth of nationalism, emergence of middle class in 19th century colonial India, education and middle class, religion and middle class, political representation and middle class. So, middle class consciousness. We shall now glance into who Indian middle class were and what was their role in the growth of national consciousness in the following module: Indian middle class and growth of nationalism. The history of colonial India is incomplete without the history of Indian middle class. Whether in the arena of politics or culture, middle class actors have been central to most of what conventionally passes as the history of modern India. Movements related to nationalism, feminism, religious revival, social reform, the visual arts, literature and myriads of other fields of endeavour have been led by middle class activists and often reflected their middle class sensibilities. With decolonization, a middle class leadership eventually replaced the British ruling class in India. Middle class. It is quite difficult to define the middle class. Literally, the middle class presumes a three-class model of a society. That is, there is a top or an elite class, a bottom or a subaltern class, and in between them a middle class. But no society has ever had such easy or simple divisions. There has never been a single bounded social group or one set of economic indicators that can be conclusively defined as middle class. Rather than looking for conclusive definitions or boundaries, it is much better to realize that the middle class, as the term is commonly used, is a cultural construct and therefore a contingent one that varies over time and context. Yet, at the same time, there were more overlaps than differences among those who called themselves middle class. It is precisely such intersections that make it possible to talk about a middle class in colonial India. Emergence of middle class in 19th century colonial India. The middle class in colonial India was a product of relatively long historical process and was predicated on the creation of new forms of politics, the restructuring of norms of social conduct and construction of new values guiding domestic as well as public life. All of these transformations, whether political, social or cultural, reflected the concerns and perhaps the contradictions constitute of the middle class. Understanding how this middle class was made and how it acquired its predominance in public affairs is critical to comprehending much of the cultural and political world in the 21st century. Measured by any set of objective indicators such as income, consumption, occupation or even education, the social groups described as middle class in colonial India were in the top two deciles of the population. Most of the men who called themselves middle class were upper caste Hindus, Ashraf Muslims, or other such high status groups. Many came from so called service communities, that is, from families and social groups who had traditionally served in the court of indigenous rulers and large landlords. Not only did this mean they had sufficient economic resources, but they also possessed sufficient educational training to shape and participate in public debates during the colonial era. Education and middle class. Exposure to Western style education was certainly the most important and marketable skill that produced the middle class. But mere knowledge of English, similarity of family background, or even exposure to Western education did not transform these educated people into a middle class. Education and literary accomplishments had been valued for long before the British came to India. What made the middle class of the 19th century different was initiation of new cultural politics that allowed them to articulate a new set of beliefs, values, and modes of politics, distinguishing them from other social groups both below and above. Through this endeavor, they became significant player in social and political life of colonial India. In colonial India, as elsewhere around the world, a middle class emerged from processes by which intellectuals and activists created a new distinctive social category through a self-conscious interposition between people of rank and the common people. British rule in India may have facilitated a public sphere, but this sphere was ultimately created by the efforts of the Indians. It was they who invested in presses, worked as journalists, created civic and political associations, and published and debated their ideas either in the press or in the forums of their associations. And it was through these activities and through the control of the public sphere that educated, respectable, but hardly among the richest, most powerful or influential of men in colonial India were able to successfully represent themselves as a middle class. The public sphere universalized middle class norms and allowed this class to emerge as the arbiter of social, political and cultural conduct of society in colonial India. Using new institutions of the public sphere, these men recast ideas of respectability to distinguish themselves from upper and lower classes in society and posited a moral superiority over both. These were crucial elements in the constitution of a middle class. There were some challenges to the aspiration of the Western educated Indians from within Indian society, but the most vocal challenges came from the British rulers of India and their representatives. The charge most often levelled against Western educated Indians was that their Westernization rendered them inauthentic. The distinction between authenticity and inauthenticity found a significant echo in debates with Indian society too, and were to have a profound impact on the constitution of the middle class in this time. Both modernization and traditionalism were an important part of middle class interventions and had a formative impact on the shaping of the political and cultural milieu of the modern India. Religion and middle class. Religion was an important sphere of intervention for middle class activists in colonial India. One example of how middle class concerns shaped social and cultural life in colonial India is evident in the growth and popularity of the Arya Samaj. The Samaj sought to create a singular Arya Dharma from the welter of beliefs and practices that characterized popular Hinduism, and this was led and supported by the people who were hardly traditional elites or religious specialists. They claimed the Vedas to be the foundational text of the revamped Hinduism. But the Arya Samaj was not only a derivative set of ideas shaping Hinduism in the image of their rulers, it was also an important intervention in Indian social life. The 19th century saw a number of comparable interventions led by middle class Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs or other religious groups. The lower classes, castes and women were the target of the reformers, and they sought to create a new orthodoxy in which middle class men reconstructed the patriarchy by imposing dual burden on women by being modern companions to their educated husbands and simultaneously be the repositors on carrier of tradition. As a wide variety of research has demonstrated, these reforms restricted and often took away the limited freedoms they had been permitted within older forms of patriarchy. Some historians have argued that the Indian middle class retreated to an inner domain focusing on religion, culture and family issues during the 19th century, so as to ready the nation for later political contestation. But the political was an important sphere of their activities in the last quarter of the 19th century too. Political representation and middle class. As the British devolved a little authority to Indians through local self-government measures, the Indian middle class made demands for greater political representation. Nationalist political activity in the 19th century was led by and displayed all the contrary pulls of the middle class. In India, we can trace the contradictions of the middle class imagination produced by the circumstances of their emergence. On the other hand, the Western educated men who formed political associations such as INC were working towards a modern secular national state with representative institutions that mirrored what they saw in Europe or North America. Their heroes were figures such as Mazzini or Garibaldi. They looked up to the liberal members of the Indian civil service and British parliamentarians, and indeed had a fair number of supporters among them. Much of the middle class politics had to do with creating forms of politics that highlighted the superiority of the Western educated men to both the traditional elite as well as the plebeian or subaltern groups in Indian society. They participated in the election that the colonial government instituted in 1880s with gusto. In the city of Lucknow, for example, middle class activists tried to show how both the former aristocrats and current landlords were unsuitable representatives of the people, while the plebeian elements were deemed to be uncouth and uneducated to be even considered suitable for representative politics. Middle class nationalism. Nationalism begets a strong sense of unity and is itself begotten by it. The British government could realize that nationalism knows no barrier, racial, linguistics, or religious, even though commonness in these spheres is as strong base for it. Deliberate attempts were therefore made to divide the Indian people in as many ways as possible. The foremost step was introduction of communal electorates and consequent growth of communalism. If Indians claimed that they constituted a nation, the Muslims were made conscious of their separate nationalism, and this was a master stroke of the imperialistic power. The intention of the British government is clear from the statement of the Indian Statutory Commission, which says the communal tension is a manifestation of the anxieties and ambitions aroused in both communities by the prospect of India's political future. So long as authority was firmly established and in British hands and self-government was not thought of, Hindu-Muslim rivalry was confined within a narrower field. The coming of reforms and the anticipation of what may follow them have given new points of Hindu-Muslim competition. Nehru's economic program was a counterpoise to this growing communal bitterness, and he was alive to its nefarious character. He said the Congress argued that the communal problem had arisen from a certain set of circumstances which enabled the third party to exploit the other two. In order to solve it, one had either to get rid of the third party or get rid of that set of circumstances. A real solution of the problem will only come affecting all religious groups and cutting across communal boundaries arise. Apart from the upper middle classes who live in the hopes of office and patronage, the masses and the lower middle classes have to face identical economic problems. It is odd and significant that all the communal demands of any group of which so much is heard have nothing whatever to do with these problems of the masses and lower middle class. This shows the superficial character of the communal problem, and this took a heavy toll in the form of partitions of the country. The second step against Indian unity was bolstering up of the Indian princes. They had created terrible barriers on the way to establishment of responsible government in India. The state rulers were made to feel that with the advent of democracy in India, their goodies will be exposed to danger, and as they had been faithful friends and allies of the British sovereign, His Majestic government could not leave them in the lurch while transferring power to the Indians. Like the Muslims, the Indian states rulers were made distinct partners in administration through the contemplated Federation of Act of 1935, and they were given an assurance that when the British eventually quit India, they will be handed back their sovereignty. His Majesty's government constantly harped on agreements with the Muslims and the princes as the condition precedent to conceding the demands of the Indian nationalism. Of course, Nehru, while commending the objectives resolution of the Constituent Assembly on the 13th December 1946, said, "Some people have pointed out to me that over or mentioning a republic may somewhat displease the rulers of the Indian states. It is possible that this may displease them, but I want to make it clear that I do not believe in the monarchical system anywhere. Our view in regards to the Indian states has been that the people of those states must share completely in the freedom to come. And I hope that in all matters relating to the states, this House will deal with the real representatives of the states." Finally, when we make a constitution for India, it must be through the representatives of the people of the states as with the rest of the India. This forthright enunciation of the principles and policy was a red rag to the state's bull, and the state's ruler created no little troubles at the time of transfer, and thanks to the statesmanship of the Lord Mountbatten and later expert handling of the situation by Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel, the state problem was happily solved without any bloodshed. Nationalism knows no artificial boundary of territory, and when it achieved a manner of success in British India, the states had to succumb to it. The third attempt for destroying Indian unity was the establishment of the Federation. This was a device to assuage the Muslims' demand for regional autonomy and the British desire to rope in autocratic states with semi-democratic provinces. Provincial autonomy stood as the sin for the federal structure, and this hardened gendered provincial bitterness which threatened to destroy the fabric of the national unity. Referring to the demand for the provincial autonomy in the political sphere, Nehru said, "An astonishing and fatal suggestion for playing into the hands of our imperialistic rulers. We who have labored for Indian unity can never be parties to any proposal which tends to lessen that unity. That way lies disaster and a disruption of the forces working for freedom. First issues will sink into the background, independence itself will fade away, and the narrowest provincialism will rise its ugly head." His apprehensions came very near being true. The provinces became the battlegrounds for various political parties and groups, and once in office, congressmen showed symptoms of following independent and sometimes even conflicting policies in different provinces. Political centralization through the Congress parliamentary subcommunity arrested the centrifugal tendency, and the individual civil disobedience movement of 1940 and the Quit India movement of 1942 chastened congressmen with the reinforcement of the nationalist touch. The cabinet delegation of 1946 had almost succeeded in balkanizing India through their group plan. It is only attainment of independence in 1947 and the chairmanship of the Union Powers Committee of the Constituent Assembly by Jawaharlal Nehru that saved the situation. Nationalism in India had thus provoked British imperialism to adapt countermeasures in the form of communalism, incitement to Indian states, and establishment of provincial autonomy as a prelude to a federal setup, each of which had a serious repercussions the ultimate evolution of constitutionalism. The role of middle class in the growth of the national consciousness. The educated middle class played a leading role in the growth and spreading the idea of nationalism all over the country. Firstly, the educated middle class all over the country began to develop a common outlook on the problem of their motherland. Secondly, the middle class also communicated with similar people in different parts of the country as the middle class had the knowledge of English. Thirdly, through books, journals, pamphlets, etc., the middle class made the people conscious about the economic, social and political problems that country faced. Fourthly, through books, propaganda, the middle class developed a sense of awareness about national feeling. All this paved the way for the growth of national consciousness among the Indian people. Now, let us see how the consciousness developed among the middle class. During the 19th century, apart from popular uprising and revolts at the Massal Well, a new consciousness was developing in the educated sections and middle classes. It was this middle class consciousness which became the chief medium for the channelization of popular discontent and was instrumental in the development of national consciousness in India. The educated classes began to critically examine the Indian society, and the awakened sections made all out efforts for reforms. Rajaram Mohan Roy was a pioneer in this field. He established Brahma Samaj to fight social evils. Dayanand Saraswati formed the Arya Samaj. Vivekananda established Ramakrishna Mission. A number of other organizations were formed for doing away with the social evils like sati, untouchability, rituals, etc. These reform movements, though confined in a large part to a middle class sections, developed a nation social consciousness among the Indian people and deepened their sense of belonging to a common culture. Besides this social consciousness, political consciousness was also developing. As noticed earlier, the educated Indian middle class, which included merchants, traders, industrialists, professional groups like lawyers, teachers, journalists and doctors, were also suffering under the British rule. As compared to the peasants and workers, this class could see more clearly the imperial designs and analyze the nature of colonial rule. In the beginning, that is the first half of the 19th century, this class was of the opinion that the means of communication, railways and other industrial enterprises were going to the benefit Indians. Under this understanding, they therefore supported the British policies, but gradually it became clear that the British administrative measures were to help British rule and their economic policies were benefiting the British merchants and capitalists. Once the Indian middle class realized this, they started protesting against the colonial rule. But unlike the peasants, tribals and workers whose protest was expressed in the form of uprising and revolts, this class followed a different policy. The middle class worked in two ways. First, they started writing books, articles and publishing newspaper to critically analyze the British policies and developing consciousness among the masses. The second method adopted by the middle classes was to form organizations, associations and societies for joint programs and activities. Let us first examine the literary activities. Ram Mohan Roy was a pioneer in this field. He produced a number of books and started a journal called Sambat Kaumudi, Bengali, which published several articles on varied themes. Dinabandhu Mitra wrote the play Nil Darpan depicting the plight of indigo cultivators. Bankim Chandra, who wrote Anand Mat, full of nationalist aspirations. In Urdu, a large number of works were written in prose and poetry about the degrading conditions of the masses and destruction of many urban centers. In Marathi, Hindi and Tamil also a number of works were published. A number of periodicals and newspapers in different languages started publication. These publications were in English and vernacular languages. The prominent among these were the Hindu Patriot, Amrita Basar Patrika, Bengali, Sanjeevi Vani in Bengal, Native Opinion Maharatha and Kesari in Bombay, the Hindu, Andhra Patrika and Kerala Patrika in Madras, the Hindustan. By 1877, there were as many as 169 newspapers in the vernacular. A number of nationalist literary figures also came into prominence, such as Bankim Chandra Chatterjee, Rabindranath Tagore, Vishnu Sastri, Chiplukar, Subramanya Bharati, Bhartendu, Harish Chandra and Altaf Hussain Hali. The second method adopted by the middle class was to form associations and organizations. Some of the early organizations were the Landholders Society in 1838, Bengal British India Society, British India Association in Bengal and the Bombay Association and Deccan Association in Maharashtra, the Madras Native Association in Madras. The main aim of these organizations was collective action against the British policies harming their interests. Their methods were mostly legal actions in courts or petition against the East India Company and the British Parliament. They wanted reforms to be included in the company's charter of 1853, but the charter of 1853 failed to satisfy their aspiration. After the takeover of India's administration by the British Crown in 1858, new hopes kindled among the Indian middle classes. They thought that British government would stop the economic exploitation and work for the welfare of the country. Soon they realized that the British Crown too was out to exploit India economically. Now the political activities increased and a number of new organizations appeared. In England was formed London India Association, which was later merged with the East India Association. In Maharashtra was formed Pune Swarnajanik Sabha and Indian Association. In Bengal was formed Indian National Congress and in Madras Mahajan Sabha. As compared to the earlier organizations formed by the middle class elements, these organizations were political. Their main aim was to protest against the British policies through petitions and resolutions. They tried to achieve mass awakening through public meetings and statements. They also exchanged views on the national issues. The nationalistic feeling when people of various religion and communities establish a sense of collective belonging and the nationalist movements grows. The nation's identity is characterized in this way. When Bankim Chandraji Chattopadhyay penned Vande Mataram for our own homeland in 1870, he first conceived this image of Bharat Mata. Bengal designed a tricolor, that is red, green and yellow flag during the Swadeshi movement. It had 8 lotuses, each symbolizing an individual region as well as a crescent moon which represented Hindus and Muslims. To conclude, in this module, we have studied about the emergence of middle class in 19th century colonial India. The education, religion and the political representation of the middle class in developing the feeling of nationalism is discussed in elaborate manner. The role of the middle class in the growth of the national consciousness is studied in the Indian society. The national consciousness which has gradually conveyed and developed in India during the British rule is also discussed. This consciousness mainly developed as a result of British policies in India. At the mass level, the popular uprising in different parts of the country strengthened the national consciousness in their own way. The middle classes gradually developed this consciousness and ultimately channelized it into the national movement. Thank you.